Welcome to Change by Design, the podcast where we shine a spotlight on engineering transformation. I'm your host, Chad Jackson, and each week we dive deep with leaders driving real change in the world of engineering. From breaking down barriers to challenging the status quo to fostering cultures of innovation and resilience, our guests share their journeys, lessons learned, and actionable insights to help you become the catalyst for positive change in your organization. Whether you're an engineer, an executive, or simply passionate about making a difference, you're in the right place. Get ready to be inspired, empowered, and equipped to engineer a better future, one change at a time. Greg Livelli, thanks for joining us today, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about your current role, your responsibilities, and where you're at today?
Yeah, Chad, I'm currently the Senior Vice President of Innovation for Harvey Performance Company. Harvey, we make machining and cutting tools. So we grind carbide into end mills, drill bits, chamfer cutters, a whole bunch of things to help out in a variety of industries, mostly the high-end industries of the aerospace, medical, dental, in the machining world. I'm responsible for all new product development, testing of the new products, and then bringing new innovations out to the market, on a regular basis.
Yeah, great, excellent. So that's a pretty cool role, good leadership position. Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of how you got there? What was your journey to this point in your career?
Yeah, so that's a great place to start. So, my career, I think, has been more of a blend of curiosity, challenge, a love for transformation. I began in the manufacturing of industrial flow meters for a small company out in Boulder, Colorado. I was working as a business development engineer for in Asia Pacific. So, at that point, I really was never even on a plane, virtually out of the country. And then since that, I've been around the world and worked in a global role my entire career. So I've had the opportunity to contribute how devices were made, how do they fit into process and technology, but ultimately, how do they provide value to the customer? So, I've been able to contribute in and how we design, produce, and deliver value is how I've kind of looked at the innovation space. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to move across functions from engineering and operations to strategic leadership roles. I've continued to expand my roles across different regions globally. And they gave me a really deep appreciation for not just how organizations work, but how people and culture drive innovation and change. So it's interesting. I did not take a straight path. Each path was kind of built on the last, whether it was turning around a struggling division, launching a new product line, leading large scale transformation programs. But I learned that innovation is just not about new technology. It's about a mindset. It's about having the courage to challenge assumptions, bring people together around the shared vision, and turn ideas into action. So ultimately, that's how I got here. It's about, following that thread and helping companies navigate disruption, finding growth through innovation, technology, but ultimately through strong execution.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great background. It's funny how we all have different kind of winding paths to get where we are today, right? And
That's correct.
yeah, yeah, good, excellent. Let's talk a little bit about managing an engineering organization. And it sounds like you've led many different types of organizations in your career. Can you talk about how leading a technical kind of product development or engineering organization is different from other types of organizations?
Yeah, I love that question, because to me, like engineering leadership and leading an organization is about kind of bridging the gap between vision and execution, right? Engineers make the things possible that the only people dream up, right? So you got to be able to see a big picture. You have to understand where business is going, which, when you're, in engineering, you don't learn a lot about the business side, but it's really important to understand where the business is going to focus on what the customer needs. And then from that, you need to translate that into a process, a system, or technology, to make it real. So we don't always necessarily believe it's about just the technical side. It's also about the people. It's about creating an environment where typically smart, creative engineers can do their best work, It's about making them feel trusted, challenged, and supported as well. So in my mind, an engineering leader is, kind of a part of an architect, part of a coach, part of a translator. You're taking those complex ideas, aligning them to strategy, helping your team bring those ideas to life in a way that really creates value.
That's good. Really great perspective. And I'd like to double click on that just for a second because, in my experience, a lot of engineering staff and even middle managers can struggle to understand the business impact of what they're doing, right? The choices they're making. So I'm curious, number one, have you seen that as a challenge? Number two, like, how do you address that? How do you upskill or upgrade the engineering team to have a better context, a better understanding of what the business needs?
Yeah, absolutely. And, to be a successful leader, to have a successful team, I kind of look at it in really three areas that really stand out to be able to do that. First is clarity of purpose, right? So, as engineers, we love to solve problems, but we need to understand why those problems matter, right? So when you connect that work directly to the business mission, which is there, you show them how their design can impact a customer or how a change can impact the quality, and that's what gets people to engage, right? So engagement is really the first part of really what has to happen and bring it along. The second part, when you have that engagement, is trust and empowerment, right? The best engineering cultures are built on, right, really safety of what they're trying to do. I've always used the term FAIL as an acronym: first attempt in learning, right? They're mistakes when you're doing them two or three times, the same thing over and over again. So you want people to feel confident enough, and that they can challenge an idea, that they can admit a mistake, they can say, I think there might be a better way, especially with the demographics of the changing of the engineering groups, and now you have engineers coming out of college, fully versed in SolidWorks or CAD programs. I didn't. We still did drawings when I when I went to college, from that side. So it's just a different environment there. So you have to kind of have an openness, when and as a leader, you got to create the space for it. And then the third part, I think, is that systems thinking. You can't not just focus on one piece of the puzzle. You got to see the whole ecosystem which is there, which is people, process, data, supply chain, customers, operations, so on, so on, and so on. And the engineering leaders typically are the central nervous system that connects all those sides of the organization, from the front end side of the business, where you're turning a concept into it, bringing it into engineering, and then the back end side of the business, turning it into cash.
That's great. What a great perspective. I mean, I like how you tied all that together. Mhm. Another quick separate question I want to ask you about is, and you touched on it, engineers are natural problem solvers. And a lot of times if you let engineers go, they will iterate on a design or a thing forever, trying to perfect it. In the context you provide, right, is really, really good. But how do you like direct that energy towards business outcomes?
Yeah, like you can never let perfect get in the way of progress. Is an interesting way to look at it. It's about creating, depending on if it's, a full platform of something you're doing or just a small iterative design of what you have. It's, how do you take that idea and how does it come to life, which is there, right? So that aspect is the area of kind of taking it into and understanding. I always, go back to value. What's there? How does it create value? How does it create value for the customer? How does it create value for the application it's going into? And then ultimately it creates value, back into the organization from where it is. So, when you see some new designer or new process, come to life, it's rewarding, right? From that aspect. And you have to be able to, kind of let people grow in there, right? When you see kind of an engineer, I say in their early stages of their career, they typically have a very difficult time finding their voice. Most of us are introverted people. that are there and don't really bring things out. So giving them that opportunity so they can take some ownership, take some accountability, maybe lead a project that isn't so, as critical as something, but gives them an opportunity to be able to do that so you can, be able to go forward. But the hard part, with that is, especially in a business environment, there is bureaucracies, there's short-term thinking, there's this is the way we've always done it mentality that's there. So you kind of have to be able to see, make sure they can see what's possible, where's the organization's readiness for what's being done, and how do you do it so you can watch people grow, in their role to, as I say, continue to create value for customers. And if you're creating value for customers, you get a bit of stickiness with those customers because they'll continue to come back to you and usually do repeat business.
Great perspective. I love that. Absolutely love it. Mm. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about what makes a good engineering leader. And I'd love to get your perspective both on, as you're looking at kind of promoting maybe staff level engineers into middle management, and as people make the transition from middle management into upper level management engineering, what do you think are some key characteristics and traits that will contribute to success? And especially maybe if people are self-evaluating and trying to figure out, hey, is this a good career path for me? What should they keep in mind?
Yeah, another great question there, and interesting because it's pretty loaded with a couple concepts there, right? Who knows what they want to do when they're coming out of school? I wanted to be a chef. I didn't get the opportunity to be a chef. My father said I was going to engineering school. I could go to cooking school afterwards. However, in history, I've been able to, kind of take that and run with it into a variety of different careers. Usually engineers are natural problem solvers, so they typically can work across multiple functions within a business because of the analytical mindset that they have. But my view has always been the engineering side or the research side is always an area where a competitive advantage can happen. So everybody wants to be in that winning team where you can be able to get there, and it doesn't happen all the time in engineering, right? There's probably a lot more fails than successes going forward, but those failures are the ones that kind of move you, where it is. So it's, part of the thing, what you have to do is, think about on the design side, think about, how do you do things? How do you take the unrealistic and make it realistic? I tell my engineering teams, you're going, especially when you're, driving transformation or driving change in that, that you're going to become uncomfortable a bit to become comfortable in the future. And again, when we're black and white and how we think about things, uncomfortable is a very difficult place to operate in. So, as I say, you have to give that trust and empowerment, that's there. Create a space for it. As I say, go back to, yeah, there is a better way to do things, and you have to listen to that. I've been doing this for a long time. Yeah, things have changed. The market and technology continues to change. One of the things I tell my team is today is the last day technology change is going to move this slow, right? So if you think about that, the changes that happened in the past 50 years outpaced that of the previous 5,000 years. And what's going to change in the next 5 years is going to outpace that of the previous 50 years, right? The iPhone is only 15, 16 years old, and nobody can even remember, what we did without it. So,
Right.
I think it's an opportunity to, become, really a natural problem solver. Um, Sometimes we tend to over own things which are there, so that gets into the bureaucracy side of it, where there's that short-term thinking. But you can do it. So the opportunity is to how do you, create an area where there's opportunity to grow, opportunity to think, and opportunity to take some accountability and ownership, where you can truly innovate and drive something new into the market.
That's great. I love it. That's a great perspective again. Mhm. Let's talk a little bit about, for you, what's most satisfying or fulfilling as an engineering leader? What makes you happy as you do this, as you fulfill this kind of role?
Yeah, so like my leadership skills are more and competencies are more along the transformational leadership style, right? So how do you provide a vision and a focus of what to do and allow people to be part of a team or individual, it depends on how it is, to be able to take that going forward. So giving people the opportunity. when you have that mindset, it's not just about some individual person trying to do things, it's about the greater good of the organization, and the intrinsic reward sometimes comes from, yeah, getting to that area which is there. So, mine is, the most fulfilling side is, seeing those ideas come to life, but seeing those ideas come to life from somebody who maybe would shock you that they brought something up along those lines, going forward. So, having the ability to do that, as I said, finding an engineer that finds their voice and wants to take ownership and step up and take accountability is another area where, I get fulfilled, going forward. Flip side, yeah, everybody's going to say the bureaucracy, the corporate world, the executives, which I participate on that, in that world. That usually is the limiting factor, and sometimes the disenchanting side, which is there because everybody likes to, can throw arrows and shoot arrows at somebody, and say what's wrong with things because they've done it before. But yeah, times are changing, and they are the next generations of leaders in companies and in organizations going forward. So if you don't give them the opportunity, I'm not sure how they're going to be able to move forward with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Very interesting. Um, let's shift gears again. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the engineering operating system, right? So processes, procedures, personnel, technology that you get in place to kind of execute the mission for engineering. And let's start with, I mean, because you describe yourself as a transformational leader, and innovation is such a big component there. Um, how do you balance kind of well-known, proven processes and approaches with innovative, new, exploratory discovery type of stuff? What's your attitude towards that and kind of finding better ways to do things?
Yeah, and I go back to the comment I just made of, today is the last day technology change is going to move this slow, right? It's changed everything, right? 15 years ago, most engineered products were just primarily mechanical products, which are there. Today, they're multi-dimensional domain systems, which are there. They have mechanical, electrical, electronic, software, in them as well. So that shift is kind of really completely transforms how engineers and operate. You cannot really operate in silos anymore. Mechanical, electrical, and software teams have to work in parallel. It's not sequential. Integration is part of the heartbeat of an organization to bring that along, right? And typically, it was done in series. The mechanical part was done first, then the electrical part, and then the software part came in on the third. So, that's a process to kind of bring those all together. As I said, the pace of change is faster. Software cycles move in weeks, not months and years, at this point. So the old model, when you lock the design down, built a prototype, tested in phases, doesn't really work anymore. The world of digital twins, simulation, real-time data flowing across disciplines is important from there. So from a leadership standpoint and a culture, it requires a new kind of an organization, one that is more collaborative, one that is more system thinking, and one that is more iterative on what they're trying to do. The best engineering organizations operate kind of like a living system, constantly learning, constantly adapting, and constantly moving forward. If you kind of stay in your place, you're eventually going to get past. And I read a book, long time ago, in the 1980s, called Deep Change, and it was really about if you don't change, you're going to die a slow death. And you can look at some of the companies, and historically, like Nokia, like Kodak, like Blockbuster, that didn't do those things, as businesses. So it requires a constant process to continuously learn and adapt.
Great stuff. Good. There's one thing I want to kind of double click into here, and that is, um, some organizations pursue a continuous improvement type of approach where they're always ready for change and they're continuously changing and getting better and evolving. And then I see some organizations that they can tolerate change in phases, but they want to get to a steady state. Like, okay, let us know what we need to do on a day-to-day basis, on a repeated basis, and let us go execute that again and again and again. Can you talk to me about those two phases? I mean, do you advise companies go after the continuous improvement all the time? Or Is there a balance there? What is the balance? I'd love to get your perspectives.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of organizations struggle with that balance going there, right? For me, process is a framework. It's not a cage or handcuffs, which are there. You do need to be structured, in an engineering environment. You need, my experience is always bringing in, especially organizations that don't have an innovation structure or culture. How do you bring in defined gates? How do you bring in design controls? How do you bring in documentation? How do you bring in traceability, right? And the entrepreneurial companies usually don't have that. They're just running as fast as they can. But that's the backbone of that quality and compliance that you have to bring products out there. Okay. On the flip side of that coin, if you make the project too rigid, it kills any creativity. It slows learning, and why a lot of smaller companies don't want to go into those processes because they believe it'll slow down their development side. So the key there is know where to be structured and where to be flexible. In my teams, we tend to be very structured around governance and decision making, things like design reviews, safety, and validation. But when it comes to concept development and ideation, early experimentation, iterations, we try and stay as agile as possible, in that aspect. To your point, structured and agile, I don't believe are opposed. I think they complement each other. A good engineering system lets you move fast in the right areas because you have stability in others, that kind of the yin and yang of innovation and control.
That's great. That's such a good perspective to try to find a balance because I know I've seen a lot of organizations try to reconcile, agile for software development and the traditional waterfall for hardware development. And there are real struggles for companies that try to mesh the two, right? So, your guidance is great on that point.
Yeah, and it's very important for hardware companies to kind of bring in some of those agile concepts early on in the process, the sprints and scrums with customers, and bring them on. It's not as easy. Hardware needs to be really done right up front because you can't just click a button and update a software like you can do on your phone, which is there. But when you bring those customers in early and you bring them and engage them in your development and your design process, and you're taking their requirements into it, you typically get a level of stickiness with them where they, are with you through the end. And then when you're ready to launch your products, it's not, hey, let's go find the customers who want to buy that. You already have advocates that have been part of that process that are ready to implement it, day one. And
Yeah.
it kind of goes back to, I think it was Dove had a commercial. They tell two friends, they tell two friends, they tell two friends. Most of the industries are very much, connected. That they hear it, and it typically, it helps with your new product introductions to see scale at a faster pace.
Excellent. Good stuff. Let's talk about personnel. Um, so, people in the industry have been talking about the impending brain drain from boomer engineers retiring. And of course, when you look at Gen Z, who's just starting to enter the workforce, and to an extent, millennials too, they work differently. They have different expectations from work. What differences have you seen, and what strengths do each have, and how do you manage and leverage each in different ways or in complementary ways?
I think it's a mix of both, right? And it's very real, right? It's not about the type of knowledge that's there. It's where does that knowledge come from, and where is that knowledge coming in, right? Most of your, experienced engineers have a deep tactical knowledge that you cannot just duplicate in a document or, a standard engineering practice, which is there, right? So I believe the way to mitigate that is kind of twofold. First, you have to capture and codify what you can, right? So we use design standards, digital knowledge bases, simulation libraries that turn some of those into reusable assets. Again, not something that the boomers have done, right? Right? So you need a mix of personnel in there to kind of challenge the status quo, which was there, but also bring some of the new concepts that they've learned either through their experience in universities and college, their experience in their entry level positions to be able to go forward. The second part to kind of mitigate that really, and I think it's more important is how do you make sure you establish a mentorship and a collaborative program, right? How do you pair a senior engineer with a younger engineer? How do you create design reviews that are more teaching moments, encouraging reverse mentoring, where the younger engineer shares their experience with the experienced engineer, right? Those interactions are gold, when you can get them to happen. The
Yeah.
younger generation is motivated by purpose and impact. So, what you're trying to do needs to make sure that you have that in your vision, your direction, and what you're trying to go forward with. They believe their work matters and they want access to that to grow. Flip side of the coin is a lot of engineers think they should be a VP 1 year into their job. I get the benefit of I have a 26-year-old who's in the work environment, and she teaches me a lot about her philosophy, which then I can also take into my work environment because most of the engineers that we have are in the newer generation
Yeah.
going forward because the company continues to grow.
Greg, another component here is personnel. There's been lots of coverage about the impending brain drain from boomers retiring and Gen Z and millennial folks coming on board, coming into the workforce. And they have different strengths and different expectations around work. What do you do to kind of bridge any divide that might be between those generations? How do you get them to work together? How do you make them both comfortable? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think that that's very real, right? There is definitely a very different dynamic and view, within those demographics or generations that are coming into the workforce, right? There's boomers who are retiring, which have a lot of considerable amount of knowledge and expertise that potentially be walking out the door. They hold, a strong tactical knowledge which is there that you cannot just replicate in a document or a standard engineering practice, or to be able to do that. So I think the way to kind of mitigate that is twofold. You do want to capture and codify what you can. There we use design standards, we use digital knowledge bases, we simulate libraries, and we turn experience and data into reusable assets which are there. The second part there, and I think maybe more importantly, is you need some type of mentorship and collaboration, which is there, right? How do you pair senior engineers with younger engineers? How do you create design reviews that are more teaching moments that are there? Encourage reverse mentoring, where the younger engineer shares their digital and software experience with the senior engineer that always did something by drawing on a paper, and drafting it. Those interactions are gold. When you think of the younger generation, they bring a lot of motivation. They're there, but they're motivated by purpose and impact of what they're trying to do. They want to see why their work matters. They want to access opportunities for growth. As I said, I learn a little bit from I have a 26-year-old who, everybody wants to be a VP, within, 1 year into it. But understanding, what their motivation, their drive is helps, kind of build out their career paths. So my view, it's what more creating an environment that values learning, that values transparency. Everybody can contribute there, no matter where you are, how long you've spent there, to be able to go forward. But ultimately, it's about keeping best the generations engaged, because the power of both of them will be greater than each of them individually. So in the end of the day, I don't always think about it as age or a demographic which is there. I think about it as how do you drive a culture where everybody's contributing to the greater good and bringing their knowledge and their basis to help move forward to create value.
Yeah, great perspective. I love that. I mean, I know a lot of engineering leaders that they're putting a lot of mind share into answering that question. I think your perspective is a really great one. Um, I'd like to talk about metrics and how do you measure success of an engineering organization? In the past, I've seen number of production drawings released as a metric of, hey, you're doing a great job, or maybe not. Um, what have you seen? What do you like to use in terms of a metric? Love to get your perspective there.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because metrics are always tricky in engineering, right? You're measuring creativity, and that is a pretty subjective way to do it. It doesn't necessarily fit into a spreadsheet like all of us like to use as an engineer. So I kind of think of metrics in three different categories. I think of them in impact, efficiency, and engagement. Those three. So impact is about measuring the outcomes. That's time to market, product performance, customer satisfaction, percentage of revenue from new products. And they kind of show where the business side of it, which we talked a little bit earlier, is how is it moving the business forward. Efficiency is around your workflows, which are there. How do you deal first pass yield on design reviews? How do you improve your engineering cycle times? How do you prototype iteration rates, which are there, right? They help you find some of the friction points and the pain points, in your process. And then the last one is the engagement, right? And that is turnover, development participation, pulse surveys, engagement surveys, which are there. Right? Typically burned out or disengaged engineering teams don't really deliver innovation sustainably, which is
Yeah.
there. So it's, it's hard to bring that in. So the matrix that, don't work or anything that treats engineering like a factory, right? I don't think you can do that. It's not an operations environment that they're there. Counting drawings on released or hours logged. It's not activity. It's not productivity. You can be 100% busy but not delivering value. So I think it's really good engineering matrix are based on accountability with empowerment. They show progress but not output. And how do you kind of take those to work together to move to the greater good? It's not always that continuous improvement culture, even though we're always kind of moving for the future. But if you're not measuring things and you're not looking at where your pain points are, your sticky points are, how do you continue to move forward to produce more output, be more innovative, spend more time on ideation rather than development, so you're constantly bringing out more areas which are there. Because if you go back to, I think you talked about the engineering operating system. If I think of that in the future, it's built on that integration, that agility, and that learning aspect. Integration is no product or function stands, alone anymore. Agility is technology and markets are evolving too fast for static processes. And learning is because your people and your culture are your competitive advantage. They are your greatest assets, which are so if they can all work together and engineering stops being a department and maybe a strategic engine, it is driven for innovation and growth.
Great. Outstanding. I love how you weaved all of that together into a cohesive vision of how engineering should operate. And it was really, really great. Um, I'd like to talk about change initiatives, digital transformation. Um, at a high level, can you talk to me a little bit about how you think about those initiatives? Some people, it gives people anxiety, a lot of stress, any kind of change. Other people thrive in change environments. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you approach it?
Yeah, I definitely can. I always think that those initiatives are important, right? Because they're taking it along the lines. Nobody likes change, and typically, usually you get change down from an executive or a consultant comes in and says, "Hey, you guys should do this," but how do you bring it into the culture? So I like to treat initiatives as more they're part of the system, not isolated projects, because isolated projects become more events rather than how do they become more of the culture going forward. So there's kind of three ways I look at that, in three different layers. The first is it aligned strategically with what the organization is trying to do, right? So it needs it needs to back the company's larger objectives, whether it's reducing cost, improving quality, accelerating innovation, improving the customer experience. If people don't see how it connects to the why, it'll never stick, right? Everybody goes back into to their own world. The second is on process clarity, which is there. You got to map out how that works. It's not never really works on how you think, which is there, and then identify where value is created. And you can do some of those value stream mapping things, especially on as you're trying to bring things out to understand where value is created and where value is wasted, right? So some of those lean principles, come to life in engineering, which usually isn't looked at in organizations. Everybody looks at the lean side of how we can do the Salesforce, in the commercial aspect, and how we do the operations side. But there's a lot of opportunity within the engineering function, to be able to do that. So, reality can come to life. And then the third is always in any change process is the behavioral change, right? And that's the hardest part, but frankly, it's the most important part, right? You cannot just change the process and think everybody's just going to jump on board. You have to shift mindsets, right? So it means engaging people early, giving them ownership in creating the process with there. But also, I think what you forget about sometimes when initiatives are being driven from a strategic level is you forget to stop and celebrate success, which is the next level, to move on. Small wins along the way, kind of move at that. So when I look at improvement in initiatives, it's never really just about the efficiency. It's about typically building a culture of adaptability, and what changes becomes part of the DNA rather than just an event for a period of time so people can go back to what they were doing in the past.
Gotcha. Yeah, really good, well thought out perspective. Thank you, Greg. Um, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of top down versus bottom up type of initiatives. Sometimes you do have an executive that comes down and says, we need to have this change for a company strategic reason. There's also grassroots levels that come bottom up, right? That say, hey, we have this problem in our process. We want to make a change so that it will become more efficient, more productive, so on and so on. How do you weigh those? Love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a real change, and honestly, I love the grassroots energy that comes about it, which is there. I think when people are passionate to drive change on their own, that's a sign of a healthy organization, which is there. So it does, it's usually driven from below. But the problem sometimes with that is they can be awful fragmented, right? Lots of people trying to fix lots of local problems, but not always aligned on the direction, which is there. So I always try and change the energy into something that's more structured. So, let's elevate this. Let's look at what's happening. Let's align it with the broader priorities. And then if we need to, formalize it as a pilot or integrate it into a bigger initiative, going forward. Typically the pilot, way is my normal way to go first because it proves something out and then and again gets others to kind of get on board when they see the improvement and want to go. I do believe the worst thing that you can do, as a leader, especially in those grassroots products, is shut down that energy. And too many times that happens, when it's driven from above. That this is how it is. You're not experienced enough. You don't know where it is, and that's a fault of executives, in companies that get there. If somebody sees a problem and cares enough to act, you want to nurture that, right? You want to make sure that's part of the coordinated system and not just a connection of disconnected fixes that are there where tribal knowledge, happens, and if that person leaves going forward. So I think grassroots sometimes are the spark. I do as I go back to that, newer demographic of the less experienced engineer or the younger engineer that's coming in. They're the spark that's driving change. And I believe as a leader, it's my job or the leader's job to, add oxygen to that and give it life and give direction so they can kind of take it and run with it. Now, you as a leader, you're also going to look at that and understand, yeah, maybe I've been down that path before and not stop it, but hey, here's some things you better, look out because we've tried this and it didn't work. But a different perspective, opening the aperture a little bit can tend to bring some problems, but it's the energy that you have of people wanting to drive change, which is, nobody likes change in an organization. When you have that energy, I believe you have to harness it and continue to move it forward.
I love that. I think that's such a great perspective. And frankly, I mean, with the research we've conducted, like a repeated theme is that as an engineering organization with change initiatives, there tends to be so much focus on technology. Like we like to go down the technical track, but repeatedly, the biggest challenges around change initiatives are very people oriented, right? It's resistance, it's training, it's all that kind of stuff. And what I like about your response is it's very much like, hey, people are invested, people care. They're coming to you not because not because they don't care or they want to do worse, it's because they want to do better, right? And you don't want to squash that, you want to empower it. So I love that answer from you.
Yeah, you have to harness that energy because when you get it, you have people who are just driven to do better, right? And it's not. I always think of performance manage, processes when you're there. Like those people aren't meeting expectations. Those people are exceeding your expectations, right? They're coming to the next level. And the good part about that is when you harvest that energy, and it's something I say, I heard a lot, when I came in to Harvey that we're a great company, great company, great company. Well, what happens when you hit the level of great? You go back to being good, right? Because the next level grade is how do you go above that? So how do you continue to drive that culture, use that energy to spark continuous innovation, ideation, which is there, but driving for the next level of excellence, not being happy with this is where we ended up.
That's great. Great, great, great. Um, what do you think with these change initiatives? What do you think are, say, the top three most important factors that contribute to success?
Huh, that's an interesting question. Well, so I do believe there's tension that happens there. So how do you kind of get through that tension on continuous improvement? It's an area where I think there's an opportunity that you can have a balance between stability and evolution. From that process as well. So I think that's the area. Go back to the balance, which we kind of talked about earlier. But I think I go back to, what I said earlier. I still believe it's strategic alignment with what you're trying to do because that has your executive engagement and your director level engagement going forward. What is the clarity and where are you trying to do and what's the direction and vision which is there? And then how do you kind of make behavioral change part of a cultural change, not just an individual change, right? As I go back to humans are your greatest assets, it's not just going out and changing, all right, let's go from AutoCAD to SolidWorks. It's about putting something in that drives, okay, we're doing more now 3D drawings rather than 2D drawings because it's 2025, not, 2000 anymore, from that
Mhm.
aspect. So how do you kind of take that behavioral change and engage people in that ownership of it? Be my three things.
Yeah. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Um, let's shift gears again. Let's talk about design and development competencies. You mentioned earlier about how the composition of products is changing, and you need new skill sets, new capabilities inside a company to develop those products. And a great example would be like battery. That is a developing battery management systems is relatively new. And boy, if you're going to be in the automotive industry, you better figure it out. So love to get your perspective. How do you figure out what new competencies you need? And then how do you build brand new competencies in an engineering organization?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, I think the first and most crucial step there is acknowledgement, right? In terms of what competencies do you have, being honest about what you do know and what you don't know. Many organizations tend to get stuck in ways that they're trying to defend their legacy rather than admitting they need to evolve. So, that's one area going forward. Um, the products we're designing today are fundamentally different from what we built, 5 and 10 years ago. As I said, they're connected, they're sensor driven, they're software controlled. This shift, requires a complete competency change across the entire organization. And for me, one of my biggest revelations was that competencies doesn't just mean skill, right? You can bring that in. It's about integration. You can have great mechanical engineers, great software developers, and great electrical designers, but if they don't understand how their work fits together, in the end, the product doesn't function as a system. And as I said, we're more system type things. So in the previously, or so we've kind of taken, more areas where we're focusing less on individual excellence and more on systems collaboration. How do you collaborate across functional groups which are there? That requires you to develop some, cross-disciplinary knowledge. Teaching mechanical engineers to think about code. I know it's heresy, which is there, but also flip side of the coin, teaching the software engineers how to understand mechanical tolerances and physics, which are there, right? So it kind of work both ways. Another big shift for me was realizing that modern product development requires data competencies, right? Understanding how data flows through a
Mhm.
product, how it's captured, how it informs designs. That's imperatively critical as the design itself, and to be able to do that. So competencies for me, I think are less about titles and more ways about thinking. As I said, system thinking, data fluency, ability to collaborate across different groups or traditional engineering boundaries that are there. Um, I think once you get that clarity and that way of thinking, it's about building learning pathways, right? So this can be formal training, it could be more, cross-functional product teams, pairing people with different disciplines together, setting up product teams that are multifunctional within an organization. Is an area, and that helps kind of go and develop those competencies. Having an ability to allow curiosity, right? And engineers are natural learners, so if you give them permission to explore new technologies or new ways of working, they typically can build those competencies pretty quickly. So it's not as far as what you want to do. And I know there's titles on charts which are there, which says you have those competencies. But I think companies kind of spend too much time ever reorganizing the competencies instead of bringing them together, right? Changing reporting lines does not build the capability. Experience and collaboration does. So the key to focus on knowledge, not the structure of it, and how do you take that moving forward?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I'm tracking and makes a ton of sense. Um, are there any, I don't know, I don't want to call it a shortcut, but are there any ways that you can accelerate things by partnering with some other companies, maybe company organizations or teams that have competencies in these areas where you want to get better? Like, what's that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely ways you can partner, right? Typically hardware companies that want to become software companies never really succeed. Right? They don't have that knowledge, they don't have that system thinking, which is there. However, they're really good subject matter experts in the software side. So how do you partner with them to be able to do that? You can partner with university and research centers, as well, right? So there's opportunities that are there that are usually not done on the manufacturing scale, but the concepts that are there that maybe haven't been thought about can bring some new ideas and competencies into that to have that. So using that. And then working across boundaries of corporations. There's things you have to worry about in terms of sharing and antitrust and those aspects which are there. But if you can partner with somebody to be able to do that, I think what you have to do is really identify where your competencies are and then what does it take to get to that level. If you identify a gap, you have a couple levers to pull that are there depending on the situation. So if the competency is strategic but still developing, that's a good area to partner first, right? So as I said, bring an outside expert, university, technology partners, co-develop, do something along those lines going forward. If it's critical to your value proposition, right, something that really defines your differentiation, then you want to build that into internally or acquire it, right? And you see, in today's world, there's a lot of acquisitions going on, bringing things in. It can accelerate your capability. Flip side of the coin, integration and culture is also difficult to bring that in,
Sure.
along with it. So you have to make sure that, the culture is the fit, the learning along the way works as well. And then there's that, hybrid path, which always exists, borrow, learn, then your own, right? Which is there. Sometimes that's hard to do because, when you're working with a partner, they might not share everything along those lines if they think that's, where you're going to. But, your teams will learn over time by doing it over again, and then eventually they internalize that. So I think the biggest accelerator is not just partnership or expectation. It's about a mindset. If your organization is curious, humble, and hungry to learn, then there are ways you can build those competencies faster than you think. You just have to open your eyes differently than what you normally would do, because if you normally would do that, you would have those competencies. And since you don't have them, you kind of have to put down your fence and your wall that's there and open your aperture, to others who can help along the lines. So.
Yeah. Good stuff. Excellent. Um, yeah, this has been a great conversation. I love to get your perspective on, being an executive running an engineering organization, and this has been a great. I really appreciate you taking the time today. Great conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I appreciate the time as well. And to maybe give you a summary, I think that the future belongs to the organization that can balance innovation with execution, stability with change, and technology with humanity, which is there. When you can do that, and as a leader, it's our job to make sure we condition that for the future, to connect people to the purpose and break down those barriers that turn that complexity into clarity.
Mhm. Good stuff. Excellent. Again, Greg, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time. Looking forward. Maybe we'll have you on again in the future.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time as well, and I look forward to it.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, make sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send us a message, leave a review, or join the discussion on our social media pages. Until next time, take care and talk soon.